Hello everyone, I hope you're keeping safe and well. Today I thought we could listen to the story The Magic Finger by Roald Dahl and illustrated by Quentin Blake. So in this story we have got the girl, we have got Philip Gregg, we've got William Gregg and we've got Mr. and Mrs. Gregg. The farm next to ours is owned by Mr. and Mrs. Gregg. The Greggs have two children, both of them boys. Their names are Philip and William. Sometimes I go over to their farm to play with them. I am a girl and I am 8 years old. Philip is also 8 years old. William is 3 years older. He is 10. What? Oh, all right then. He is 11. Last week something very funny happened to the Gregg family. I'm going to tell you about it as best I can. Now the one thing that Mr. Gregg and his two boys loved to do more than anything else was to go hunting. Every Saturday morning they would take their guns and go off into the woods to look for animals and birds to shoot. Even Philip, who was only 8 years old, had a gun of his own. I can't stand hunting, I just can't stand it. It doesn't seem right to me that men and boys should kill animals just for the fun they get out of it. So I used to try to stop Philip and William from doing it. Every time I went over to their farm, I would do my best to talk them out of it, but they only laughed at me. I even said something about it once to Mr. Gregg, but he just walked on past me as if I wasn't there. Then, one Saturday morning, I saw Philip and William coming out of the woods with their father, and they were carrying a lovely young deer. This made me so cross that I started shouting at them. The boys laughed and made faces at me, and Mr. Gregg told me to go home and mind my P's and Q's. Well, that did it. I saw red, and before I was able to stop myself, I did something I never meant to do. I put the magic finger on them all. Oh dear, I even put it on Mrs. Gregg, who wasn't there. I put it on the whole Gregg family. For months I had been telling myself that I would never put the magic finger upon anyone again, not after what happened to my teacher, old Mrs. Winter. Poor old Mrs. Winter. One day we were in class and she was teaching us spelling. "Stand up," she said to me, "and spell cat." "That's an easy one," I said. K-A-T. "You are a stupid little girl," Mrs. Winter said. "I am not a stupid little girl," I cried. "I am a very nice little girl." "Go and stand in the corner," Mrs. Winter said. Then I got cross and I saw red and I put the magic finger on Mrs. Winter good and strong, and almost at once, guess what? Whiskers began growing out of her face. They were long black whiskers, just like the ones you see on a cat, only much bigger. And how fast they grew! Before we had time to think, they were coming out of her ears. Of course, the whole class started screaming with laughter, and then Mrs. Winter said, "Will you be so kind as to tell me what you find so madly funny, all of you?" And when she turned around to write something on the blackboard, we saw that she had grown a tail as well. It was a huge bushy tail. I cannot begin to tell you what happened after that, but if any of you are wondering whether Mrs. Winter is quite all right again now, the answer is no. She never will be. The magic finger is something I have been able to do all my life. I can't tell you how I do it because I don't even know myself, but it always happens when I get cross, when I see red. Then I get very, very hot all over. Then the tip of my forefinger on my right hand begins to tingle most terribly, and suddenly a sort of flash comes out of me, a quick flash like something electric. It jumps out and touches the person who has made me cross. And after that the magic finger is upon him or her, and things began to happen. Well, the magic finger was now upon the whole of the Gregg family, and there was no taking it off again. I ran home and waited for things to happen. They happened fast. I shall now tell you what those things were. I got the whole story from Philip and William the next morning, after it was all over. In the afternoon of the very same day that I put the magic finger on the Gregg family, Mr. Gregg and Philip and William went out hunting once again. This time they were going after wild ducks, so they headed towards the lake. In the first hour they got 10 birds. In the next hour they got another 6. "What a day!" cried Mr. Gregg. "This is the best yet." He was beside himself with joy. Just then 4 more wild ducks flew over their heads. They were flying very low. They were easy to hit. Bang, bang, bang went the guns. The ducks flew on. "We missed," said Mr. Gregg. "That's funny." Then, to everyone's surprise, the 4 ducks turned around and came flying right back towards the guns. "Hey," said Mr. Gregg, "what on earth are they doing? They are really asking for it this time." He shot at them again. So did the boys. And again, they all missed. Mr. Gregg got very red in the face. "It's the light," he said. "It's getting too dark to see. Let's go home." So they started for home, carrying with them the 16 birds they had shot before. But the 4 ducks would not leave them alone. They now began flying around and around the hunters as they walked away. Mr. Gregg did not like it one bit. "Be off!" he cried, and he shot them many more times, but it was no good. He simply could not hit them. All the way home those 4 ducks flew around in the sky above their heads, and nothing would make them go away. Late that night, after Philip and William had gone to bed, Mr. Gregg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the call of a wild duck in the sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There was a thin yellow moon over the trees on the hill, and the sky was filled with stars. Then Mr. Gregg heard the noise of wings flying low over his head, and he saw the 4 ducks dark against the night sky, flying very close together. They were going around and around the house. Mr. Gregg forgot about the firewood and hurried back indoors. He was now quite afraid. He did not like what was going on, but he said nothing about it to Mrs. Gregg. All he said was, "Come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired." So they went to bed and went to sleep. When morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes. He was about to put a hand out for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. "That's funny," he said. "Where is my hand?" He lay still, wondering what was up. Maybe he had hurt that hand in some way. He tried the other hand. That wouldn't come out either. He sat up. Then, for the first time, he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Gregg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Gregg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too. For he was now a tiny little man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, but no taller, and where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck's wings instead. But, cried Mrs. Gregg, going purple in the face. "My dear man, what's happened to you?" "What's happened to both of us, you mean?" shouted Mr. Gregg. It was Mrs. Gregg's turn now to jump out of bed. She ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg, and she too had got wings instead of arms. Oh, sobbed Mrs. Gregg. "This is witch's work," cried Mr. Gregg, and both of them started running around the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. "Mama, Mama, Mama," chirruped Philip. "Look, Mama, we can fly." And they flew up into the air. "Come down at once," said Mrs. Gregg. "You're much too high." But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out of the window. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg ran to the window and looked out. The 2 tiny boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Gregg said to Mr. Gregg, "Do you think we could do that, my dear?" "I don't see why not," Mr. Gregg said. "Come on, let's try." Mr. Gregg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once up he went. Then Mrs. Gregg did the same. "Help!" she cried as she started going up. "Save me!" "Come on," said Mr. Gregg. "Don't be afraid." So out the window they flew far up into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William. Soon the whole family was flying around and around together. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried William. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." "Your wings are not getting tired, are they, dear?" Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg. "Not at all," Mrs. Gregg said. "I could go on forever." "Hey, look down there," said Philip. "Somebody is walking in our garden." They all looked down, and there below them in their own garden they saw 4 enormous wild ducks. The ducks were as big as men, and what is more, they had great long arms like men instead of wings. The ducks were walking in a line to the door of the Greggs' house, swinging their arms and holding their beaks high in the air. "Stop!" called the tiny Mr. Gregg, flying down low over their heads. "Go away, that's my house." The ducks looked up and quacked. The first one put out a hand and opened the door of the house and went in. The others went in after him. The door shut. The Greggs flew down and sat on the wall near the door. Mrs. Gregg began to cry. Oh dear, she sobbed. "They have taken our house. What shall we do? We have no place to go." Even the boys began to cry a bit now. "We will be eaten by cats and foxes in the night," said Philip. "I want to sleep in my own bed," said William. "Now then," said Mr. Gregg, "it isn't any good crying. That won't help us. Shall I tell you what we're going to do?" "What?" they said. Mr. Gregg looked at them and smiled. "We are going to build a nest." "A nest?" they said. "Can we do that?" "We must do it," said Mr. Gregg. "We've got to sleep somewhere. Follow me." They flew off to a tall tree, and right at the top of it Mr. Gregg chose the place for the nest. "Now we want sticks," he said. "Lots and lots of little sticks. Off you go, all of you, and find them and bring them back here." "But we have no hands," said Philip. "Then use your mouths." Mrs. Gregg and the children flew off. Soon they were back, carrying sticks in their mouths. Mr. Gregg took the sticks and started to build the nest. "More," he said. "I want more and more and more sticks. Keep going." The nest began to grow. Mr. Gregg was very good at making the sticks stick together. After a while he said, "That's enough sticks. Now I want leaves and feathers and things like that to make the inside nice and soft." The building of the nest went on and on. It took a long time, but at last it was finished. And that is the end of part 1 of Roald Dahl and the Magic Finger. Stay tuned in the next couple of days and you'll be able to listen to part 2 of the story. See you soon.